Thank you so much for joining us for today's Connected Conversation, a program conducted by the Idaho Humanities Council. If you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to check out our website, idahohumanities.org. I'd like to remind you all that you may submit any questions using the Q&A feature or the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. And with me today is Judson Finley from Utah State University. It's an honor to have you with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And this is really nice to be with you all. It's a little unusual for me in the sense that I can't see any of you right now. So hello to all of you out there, and I look forward to hearing from you. So my name is Judson Finley. I am associate professor of anthropology here at Utah State University. I'm also the department head of sociology and anthropology here at Utah State University. And I thought I'd begin by introducing myself a little bit. I grew up really in this tri-state region that is kind of the intersection of southeastern Idaho, northeastern Utah, and southwestern Wyoming, mostly in Wyoming, but I lived on a ranch for a while when I was a kid in southeastern Idaho in a little place called Thatcher. If any of you guys know where Thatcher is. My grandparents were from Salt Lake, and then my dad worked in construction in southwestern Wyoming. So I really just spent a lot of time kind of bouncing around in this area as a kid. And I grew up really with a strong sense of what it was like to live in the rural West and to be pretty connected to places and to be pretty connected to the history and also to the indigenous history. And that's really what led me to archaeology. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Wyoming. I've spent most of my career working in Wyoming and the surrounding states. I did my graduate school in Washington State University, which kind of took me up to Pullman and in the Moscow region. And that experience really made me realize just how big Idaho is and how diverse Idaho is. I've been back here at Utah State University in Logan since 2012. And it wasn't too long after that I started working in Dinosaur National Monument. So when I was asked to give this talk, I don't have work specifically in Idaho that I could talk about. I've done a lot of research around the Yellowstone region, looking specifically at kind of the contact era history of Shoshone people. But most of my work recently has dealt with the Fremont archaeological record in northeastern Utah, and specifically in the Uintah Basin and in Dinosaur National Monument. And so I thought I would share that work with you. So this will be, I understand that these talks are not all archaeology, and which is great, and that this is a very diverse audience. So I'm going to try to speak very generally about the nature of the archaeology. My archaeological training is really cross-disciplinary in the sense that a lot of my background is in geology and earth science and climate reconstruction. So I really spend a lot of time thinking about that nexus of geology, climate, and culture. And that's really what I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about within the context of farming in some of the most difficult places to farm in Western North America, and what we've come to understand about those relationships of geology, climate, and culture in relationship to what we refer to as the agricultural transition. So this is a really big kind of global problem that also we're thinking a lot about right now, because it's informing us a lot about how these kinds of early agricultural systems dealt with environmental change and what kinds of systems they developed that maintained sustainable populations and sustainable subsistence economies. So I'm going to talk about climate, and generally I'm going to try to not get into too much deep science about archaeology, but there's going to come a moment towards the end of the talk where I'm going to get very specific about climate. I'm going to talk about dendrochronology and tree ring reconstruction and what we're learning about the environment over the last 2,000 years based on that. And there's some really important lessons for us, especially in these moments where it's very hot, right? And I just came from 6 weeks in the field in Dinosaur National Monument. 100-degree days in Dinosaur National Monument are no joke. We're seeing all kinds of effects of these just really massive droughts and heat domes that are building all across the western US, over the Pacific Northwest, and into the central area, what that's doing to water and water shortages. So I think that there are some lessons to be had with that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So again, what I'm going to talk about is the Fremont archaeological record, specifically in northeastern Utah's Uintah Basin. All right, and I hope that some of you all have had a chance to visit Dinosaur National Monument, maybe been there just to sightsee, maybe been there to raft on the Green or the Yampa. But it's a really, really cool place, and I feel really lucky to be working there. Now, the National Park Service kind of tapped me to do some work initially, looking at rock art, right? Because there's so much rock art in Dinosaur National Monument and really across the state of Utah. And I agreed, because of course I would be foolish not to spend some time looking at rock art. But I find that as I've done more and more work with rock art, people are always asking me, they want to know, what does it mean, right? What does that rock art mean? This is a site called the Rochester Panel, which is down in the San Rafael Swell south of Price, Utah. It's a really, really cool panel. And I like to show this one just because it's so deeply complicated, and it's a good, I think, illustration of me saying, I don't know. I don't know what the rock art means. All right, so this was the panel that I was showing here, which is the Rochester panel. And again, it's a really, really cool panel. There's a lot of things going on here, this kind of rainbow thing, but also what looks like a bunch of monsters, and this crazy line that runs all the way through it. There's a lot of what we would consider to be classic Fremont rock art in this panel. So again, suffice it to say that this is my way of saying I don't really know what rock art means, but what I can do as an archaeologist is learn something about the context of the lives of the people who made that rock art. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. Okay, so now Fremont is also relevant in southeastern Idaho because it really does spread all the way up into the Snake River Plain and into southwestern Wyoming. But let me begin, because we're talking about agriculture, just to kind of give you a map that shows somewhat of a timeline of the evolution of the developments of maize agriculture in Western North America. All right. We see the earliest evidence of maize agriculture down just north of Tucson about 5,700 years ago. All right. And that's about maybe 2,000 to 2,500 years after maize was first domesticated in central Mexico. All right. So the thing to remember about maize is that it's a tropical grass, right? It's one of the most evolutionarily successful species on planet Earth, along with pigs, right? But it's a tropical grass that has been domesticated to grow in all different kinds of environments, all right? So what you see here is this kind of progression of maize as it moves further north, and people were selecting for traits that would allow it to be grown in environments that were cooler, drier, with shorter growing seasons, right? I've got a star right here on this area of southeastern Utah, which is the Cedar Mesa area, and that's central to Bears Ears National Monument. There's a lot of controversy over Bears Ears, but from my perspective, one of the most important things about Bears Ears is it's the heart of maize agriculture in the northern Colorado Plateau, in the sense that it was here about 3,000 years ago, 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, that maize was finally selected for a land race that could be successfully cultivated in a dry farming environment, right? And so they were able to move maize agriculture off of their floodplains and other well-watered environments up onto the dry mesa tops of Cedar Mesa. And it's from there that we start to see the spread of maize all the way north up into northern Utah. By about 1,700 years ago, right around AD 300, we see the first evidence of maize agriculture. And this is in my project area in Dinosaur National Monument, right up in northern Utah. All right. Now, bear in mind that people were growing corn all the way up here onto the northern slopes of the Uintah Range and all the way out here around the Great Salt Lake, right? You get too much further north of that and you can't grow maize at all. You get into southwestern Wyoming, and all southwestern Wyoming is good for is alfalfa, right? And you get out here into the Snake River Plain, and of course you can grow maize, but it's very specifically selected maize, genetically engineered maize that requires a lot of water. Okay. All right. So just kind of keep that time frame in mind. So let me introduce you then to Fremont, to the Fremont archaeological record. All right. It's very typical of Utah north of the Colorado River and extending into western Nevada, southern Idaho, and southwestern Wyoming. All right. But the core of what we refer to as the Fremont archaeological cultural area is Utah north of the Colorado River. You get south of the Colorado River and you're really in the ancestral Puebloan cultural area. These are transitional forager farmers, and that archaeological record pretty much well all across this area spans this time frame from about AD 300 to 1300. I really like this cartoon right here. This is from a Utah Archaeology Awareness Week several years ago that really encapsulates what the hallmark Fremont cultural traits are, right? They're maize agriculturalists. They lived in pit house villages. They practiced a mix of hunting and gathering and farming. So they're really kind of on that cusp of full-time foragers and full-time farmers. They use these very distinctive styles of manos and metates, these grinding stones. That's referred to as a trough metate or a Utah metate. Grayware pottery, and it's this grayware pottery that we see extending all the way up into southern Idaho. Very distinctive styles of anthropomorphic rock art granaries, and then what are referred to as these Fremont figurines, right? These kind of fired clay figurines that look a lot like the rock art imagery. And we also see some of the iconography that's present in these figurines and the rock art replicated in the archaeological records. So we kind of get the sense that people, the style of clothing and decoration that they wore very much mimics these figurines and the rock art. Okay. Now, remember that maize comes out of the American Southwest. Ultimately, it comes out of Mesoamerica. So it's really important to contextualize the Fremont archaeological record as being a Southwestern phenomenon, right? And so we talk about the Uintah Basin as being the absolute northern periphery. And the Fremont world has kind of been characterized more broadly as being the northern periphery of the American Southwest, kind of like the, characterized as the kind of the backwater area of farmers. And that's really a misconception, right? This is all part of a continuum, a spectrum of people who are making a living in various ways, right? Some people are more fully committed to agriculture than they are to hunting and gathering, and that shifts throughout the course of their lives. So we talk about adaptive diversity and residential cycling in the Fremont archaeological record. And simply what that means is that over the course of your lifetime, if you were living in the Fremont world during this time, you could spend part of your life fully committed to farming, and then you could move into hunting and gathering and back again to farming. People moved a lot in and out of these agricultural communities. And this is really apparent from the bioarchaeological record, looking at the skeletal stable isotope composition of people that were living around the Great Salt Lake is really where we see a lot of that evidence. Now, what I'm really interested in is the environmental conditions of this foraging and farming transition, and the conditions under which these kinds of agricultural communities formed, right? Both the social and environmental conditions. And for me, as an archaeologist, I've come to understand that this is a perspective that we can really reconstruct within the context of human generations. And that's not something we can do oftentimes in the archaeological record, because you have to realize that the archaeological record is a very coarse-grained reconstruction of past lives that operates on the order of several hundred years, right? So what we're attempting to do is squeeze time down. We're very obsessed with time in my team, and we do that using what we refer to as Bayesian chronological modeling, and then also dendrochronology. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but I'm not going to get too bogged down in those kinds of details with you guys. Okay, so let's talk about some archaeology, and I'm just going to show you, kind of give you an introduction to my study area in Dinosaur National Monument. It's really cool. And again, if you've not been to Dinosaur, I really encourage all of you guys to take a trip out there. It's worth the time and the effort. You can spend many, many days in Dinosaur National Monument and not see it all. All right, so here's the boundary of the monument right here in red. It was formed initially in 1915 to protect the Carnegie Quarry, the dinosaur quarry that Earl Douglas found, and expanded in 1938 to cover all of the kind of the wild and scenic river corridors of the Green River right here and the Yampa. All right. And there was an effort in the 1950s to try to build several dams here as part of the Colorado River Storage Project. And I think we all know where that would have ended up at, especially today, had that gone through. But you really have to see this country to believe it. It's really spectacular. This is, again, one of the northernmost networks of Fremont maize agriculturalists that we know. I've been working in a couple of areas, the Jones Hole area right in here, and then the Cub Creek area right in here. And that's what I want to kind of talk to you guys and introduce you to. This is just a composite set of photos looking at the Jones Hole area, all right? And it gets a lot of visitation because river rafters and other people come in here. It's this prime fly fishing area. So there's a lot of people that come in and see this area, and really a lot of them are interested in the archaeology. It's covered with rock art, really, really beautiful rock art. Just a small sampling of these red pigmented images that are Fremont in nature. You know, these three anthropomorphs right here wearing, you know, probably what are some kind of a quilled feathered headdress. What we refer to as the strong men, these guys that have their arms up like this. They have really, really big shoulders and these trapezoidal bodies. The landscape itself is really, really beautiful. And even though this is technically part of the Middle Rocky Mountains, it very much has a Colorado Plateau flavor to it geomorphically. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of exposed slick rock. And this exposed slick rock is really important because it directs all of the runoff, both in rain and snow, down into these valley bottoms. And this is what people were taking advantage of. Really beautiful waterfall called Ely Creek Falls or Ely Falls. This is all spring fed, right? So all of this water that's coming down this channel right here is what's ultimately running off of that sandstone and getting trapped in the valley bottoms and pushed down to the bottom. A really ideal situation if you're a transitional forager farmer, all right? So just a Google Earth kind of overview image looking down onto Jones Hole. And again, this is a Ely Creek coming down in here and Jones Hole running right down in here. You can drive in and park at the fish hatchery right here and hike down 2 miles. Really, really beautiful hike. Or if you're on the river, you camp down at the confluence of Jones Hole and the Green and hike up. But again, you can see all of this exposed slick rock. And from an agricultural perspective, and I don't know how many of you guys grow a garden, but I'm kind of, you know, since moving to Utah, I've become a wannabe farmer. I grew up farming and gardening with my grandpa and my dad. We moved away from all that. So coming back, I've been teaching myself how to garden again. And it's been a real interesting experience. And I take a lot of lessons from the archaeological record into my gardening and vice versa. But this sandstone sheds a lot of sandy sediment down here into the bottom of this canyon, right? And it also reflects a lot of heat and light. And the water that pools up down in the bottom of this floodplain creates essentially a really, really nice agricultural niche, right? It's well watered, it's warmer because of the exposed sandstone, so you get a little bit of a shield from early frosts or late frosts. So this is really important in maize cultivation. And so I like to think of this area as being a Fremont farm. So if you ever visit Jones Hole, just remember to yourself that you're seeing a Fremont farm that's about 1,000 years old. Red circles here represent rock art sites, and yellow circles represent granaries. Now remember, both rock art and granaries are part of the kind of quintessential material culture of Fremont. So I'm going to show you some photos of this granary right here. I just want to say I love the National Park Service because they pay me and my students to go out, wander around, and find archaeological sites and document archaeological sites. And it's a really, really tough job because you get to see things like this. All right. Now, I worked for about 3 years before I finally found this site. I knew it was out there somewhere, but half the process is the journey of figuring out how to find it. And once you find it, it's really easy to come to. This is a Fremont granary, all right? And what you see here is basically the wooden superstructure of a wattle and daub, what we refer to as a mud adobe or yacal structure, where people were basically just taking these sticks, lashing them together, right? You can still see the lashes on here, and when you get in close, you can still see the knots that people tied 1,000 years ago. And that to me is like, those are like snapshots in time that I love. Likewise, over here, you can see where somebody took a handful of mud and smeared it on the wall. And so you see their fingerprints preserved in this, all right? This was basically a 2-bin storage chamber that you would have reached in through the top to put corn and other kinds of things like that in, right? We think of these as being largely corn storage features, but I wanted to show you this as a reminder that these represent much more than just food storage, right? These are gear storage places as well. This is a composite fish hook that came out of that granary that I showed you, right? So here's a piece of wood. It's been carved, burned, bound together with this worked bone barb, and then sealed with a pine pitch, right? This is basically like if you're a lure fisher, this is kind of like, a prehistoric panther martin or a spinning rapala, right? Because it's got the little spots on it to make it look like a minnow as it's cruising through the water. But just bear in mind that this location is easily 3 miles from the Green River. Well, actually, like 4 miles, about 2 miles from Jones Hole. So people are storing all different kinds of stuff in granaries, and that's kind of the key point that I wanted to make there. Again, this area was used mostly between about AD 800 and 1100. All right. So now I want to show you the Cub Creek area, and this is where I've been doing a lot of my work over the last several years. And in fact, I just finished about 2 weeks ago what's been 5 years of work all over down here in the bottom of Cub Creek. This is Split Mountain, if you've ever been out in this area, and this is the absolute southernmost extent of the Middle Rocky Mountains, right? You go further south from this and you go into the Uintah Basin, and then you get to the Tavaputs Plateau, and then you're in the formal physiographic province of the Colorado Plateaus. But the Green River comes through here. Jones Hole is right up here, the area that I was just showing you. And the river comes through and comes out at Split Mountain right in here, right? And this whole area is just a really remarkable archaeological landscape, all right? And it's been well known in archaeological literature from the 1950s and 1960s when a man named Dave Bretternetz from the University of Colorado did some work here. And then it really fell off the radar screen. And part of my task was to really figure out what what was going on at Cub Creek and kind of what it meant archaeologically. But again, just to remind you, right, that this is all this kind of Google Earth aerial image doesn't really do the landscape justice. It's a really, really dramatic landscape, but you get a sense of again, the exposed sandstone, all of these box canyons that come down off of Split Mountain are channeling all of that water and sediment right down into these little areas out in here, all of which are well watered, well protected, and make excellent gardening locations. And so what we know is that this is the area that people were, when they first came into the area about 1700 years ago, I'm going to say probably from the Mesa Verde region, this kind of ancestral, what we refer to as basket maker culture, exploiting an environment that they recognized from that area, from that kind of Four Corners region. All right. So what I've done is over the last several years is really just worked to record archaeological sites and build a chronology. All right. And I'll show you kind of what that starts to look like. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the landscape. It's very arid, very dry. I think vernal receives somewhere on the order of about 12 inches of precipitation a year. So dry farming would be really, really difficult here. People really had to have a good sense of how they could water their crops to be successful farmers in this kind of an environment. But again, you get the sense of this, these slick rock landforms that are channeling a lot of water and sediment off, big arroyos. It's well watered. This is all, cottonwood groves that are growing right down in here, and then Split Mountain in the background. All right. Now, just another, kind of, I think this is a really cool image. I've been walking by this for the last couple of years, and I finally snapped a picture of it. It was just one of those things that dawned on me one day. This is near Josie Morris's cabin, and Josie was this, she was the daughter of one of the first settlers into this area called Browns Park in the 1880s. And she lived until 1964 on this cabin out in Dinosaur National Monument. And so this is right next to her property, but this shows you what people were doing during the historic period, right? This is an earthen dam, and they constructed it specifically to trap the water that was running down this chute and just maintain a pond right here, right? And you can see how thick the grass and sedges are right in here. And that just gives you a sense of how well watered these landforms are. So again, if you're a prehistoric agriculturalist trying to farm or garden, this is an excellent spot to do that. All right, so again, just to kind of give you a sense of what that landscape or some of the things look like, right? Lots of rock art. I mean, thousands of panels of rock art in this valley. What we consider to be these classic Uintah Fremont anthropomorph figures like this. One of the few really, really beautiful true cliffside granaries in Cub Creek. Again, just a landscape view looking into the area of Josie's cabin. You see Split Mountain coming down right here and all of this kind of green base. This is not irrigated right now. This is all just spring fed. All right. So again, really, really good agricultural opportunities. And the archaeological record that drew me there is these pit houses, right? And so this is a photo of one of the pit houses that the University of Colorado team excavated in the 1960s. And there's about maybe 40 of these pit houses that were excavated. And at this point in time, up until my work, we didn't have any sense of how old these pit houses were. And some people speculated they were about 1700 to 1800 years old. Some people thought they were maybe 1,000 years old. We just didn't really have any idea. So that's kind of been part of my task. All right. So now looking back over my last several years of work, this is kind of how the landscape breaks down, right? Yellow represents, the yellow dots all represent storage localities, granaries, other kinds of things like that, that all seem to be positioned along the base of Split Mountain right in here. More storage sites up here that we just started to discover this summer. That's a really interesting new discovery for us. These red sites are what we refer to as roasting sites. So if you're collecting a lot of maize and other kind of foodstuffs like pinyon pine, yampa root, other kinds of good roots like sago lily and other things like that, seeds, roasting all of those things up, people were creating a lot of these just big fires that they were burning to roast those materials. And we see a lot of evidence of that, grinding stones and other kinds of things. Blue are the pit houses. So all along, and those pit houses are really concentrated right here along this major stream of Cub Creek. And then green is the rock art sites. All right, so really 4 major categories of sites in here. And besides the locations, our primary objective has been to radiocarbon date those sites. So what I'm going to show you right now is what we refer to as a multi-plot. All right, and what I'm going to do is just compare what we refer to as these upland roasting sites with the pit house sites. All right, and all you really need to know is that these upland sites span that classic time period from about AD 300 to 1300, right? We're focused on what we refer to as short-lived annuals, so things like maize, twigs from granaries and other things like that, that really help us refine the accuracy of our reconstructions of time, right up here to about 1300, all right? And then down here is the chronology that we have from the Pit House Village. And this was a real big surprise for us. And what hopefully you can take away from this is that the ages of these pit houses are really, really tightly constrained, right? This was a very, very brief event. It wasn't people living in pit houses for 1,000 years, right? What it was people adopting maize agriculture, working out a system that was successful, using that system for several hundred years, then settling into a village for some period of time before ending that village occupation and going back to the old way of doing things, right? So this is really not what we expected in the archaeological record. And this has been really, really informative for us because it's really making us question the nature of how and when and under what environmental conditions these Fremont villages all across the state of Utah formed. All right. So I've had the luxury of working with one of my good colleagues who's a dendrochronologist. And remember that the tree ring record gives us a year by year view of precipitation conditions in the past. All right. What we're actually looking at is tree ring width, and trees respond to precipitation in the sense that when they get a good water year, the tree ring width will be wide, and when it's a dry year, it'll be narrow. All right. Most tree ring reconstructions, if you really dig into this, span the last maybe 500 years to about 800 years. All right. And so this is pretty well known throughout the Western US, this last 500 to 800 years. But that really puts us in at the very end of the Fremont record. And so I challenged my friend Justin here to build a 2,000-year precipitation reconstruction, and he thought that was a really great idea. And we worked it out, and I can talk more about how we did that. But bottom line is, you put a bunch of graduate students to work. You get out there, you carry a chainsaw, and you walk around in the worst possible environments you can imagine that will preserve trees on the landscape for 2,000 years. And so this is really hard work to build these chronologies. But this is what you're looking at, is this 2,000-year record of precipitation for northern Utah. And it has a lot of implications for climate across the Colorado Plateau, into the southern Rocky Mountains, but also into southeastern Idaho as well, southern Idaho. So let me talk a little bit about that. Again, each of these represents an annual variation, right? So when we look at the year-to-year record, it's really, really noisy. And so what we oftentimes do is we'll smooth these records out. So we'll take a running average. Blue here represents a 50-year running average. Red represents a 100-year running average. So we're just taking the noise of the year-to-year record and we're smoothing it out, all right? The black line that runs through the center is the historical mean, all right? So we use historical mean conditions as a way to calibrate our tree ring record and project it back into time. And so we can really think about deviations in relationship to the historical mean. And in this case, the historical mean, it goes back to about 1890. That's when the weather and climate data goes back to in the vernal area, all right? So I just want to point a couple of things out to you, all right? One, there's a tremendous amount of variability in the precipitation reconstruction for the past, all right? This area right in here represents the droughts of the 1950s and 1930s, all right? Those were not very bad droughts in a historical perspective. When you get back, especially into this area right here, from about AD 500 to 542, and right here in the late 1200s, those were really, really severe droughts, all right? Droughts that were sustained for several decades, all right? Now, by perspective, we're in the second decade of a pretty major drought that started following a major wet event, a major El Nino event in 1997, right? So we had some pretty severe peak drought years in 2002, 2003, and now we're seeing that again, right? And so, you know, we as humans tend to have a really, really short memory of these kinds of things. And so things look very extreme and severe out there right now, but that's part of a pattern. And they are, don't get me wrong, they are, but it's part of a pattern that has been ongoing for the last 2 decades, all right? It's starting to shape up to look like one of these really early major droughts, but we don't really know that for sure yet because we'll need some time to be able to look back on it, right? But just remember that this drought lasts for about 40 years from AD 500 to 542. People were farming successfully throughout this entire period in Dinosaur National Monument. So the indigenous agricultural strategy was successfully adapted to cope with this kind of drought conditions, all right? This chart gives people a lot of headaches, and I'm not gonna delve into it too deeply, but a different way for us to think about the precipitation reconstruction is in terms of variability, right? How much change is there from year to year and from decade to decade, all right? And again, you just kind of have to think about, like, we have some really, really wet years, like 2019, 2018 were really, really wet years. 2020 and now 2021 are shaping up to be really, really dry years, right? So we've got a lot of variability from year to year in those records. Now we can also think about variability from decade to decade, right? And again, this is the kind of variability that people remember in their culture, and particularly in their oral culture. And if you're a transitional agriculturalist who is making a living part-time foraging and part-time farming, you want to have an ideal balance of foraging and farming to offset the variability of droughts, right? So really think about agriculture as being a strategy for adjusting to droughts. So what I want to show you is that we have peak variability right here at about AD 300. So environmental conditions were least predictable right around AD 300. And that's really important to our reconstruction. This bottom chart is the one that really gives people headaches. This is what's referred to as a wavelet analysis. And all this is doing is capturing the periodicity of variability over the last 2,000 years on the x-axis, all right? And these things that are outlined in black represent significant events that are occurring on the order of about 30 to 120 years. All right. So you could expect in this area a major period of drought or moist conditions, what we would call a pluvial, every 30 to 120 years. This is what defines the last 2,000 years, except for this period right in here from about AD 750 to 1050. All right. And that dominant variability regime completely breaks down and disappears from the precipitation record. All right. Now, what's driving that in this particular case is a strengthening of the El Nino Southern Oscillation System. All right. So there's really cool relationships here between, again, what's going on in the equatorial Pacific and precipitation conditions in the interior West. So when we project this onto the archaeological record, what we see is that the first maize appears in the archaeological record right around AD 300 when variability is the highest. And in fact, this makes good sense because it's during this time that foraging returns would have likely declined and people would have needed to supplement their diet, and farming or gardening would be a good way to do that. All right. That continues through until the end of the Fremont period here at about AD 1300. But what, again, is really surprising to us is that very narrow window when that village phase was occupied from AD roughly 840 to 1080 corresponds or occurred during this period when variability broke down. All right. Now, what that means from a practical perspective is that precipitation delivery became more predictable from year to year. It's not necessarily that the mean changed, it was just more predictable. That would have perhaps, where we speculate, made returns on gardening and farming increase. And then we start to see all of the subsequent very quick responses of that, which would be an increase in population because you have more food, you have a healthier population producing more children. They settle down into a more permanent landscape style. They're building houses, they're storing, they're doing all of the things that we expect of a society that's intensified their production of agricultural products for a very brief period of time. All right. Because as soon as this variability regime returns at 1050, it's within a couple of decades that the village in Cub Creek was completely abandoned. All right. So this is a really important lesson for us in the sense that this indigenous agricultural style is a successful adaptation to a predictable drought regime that intensified when that drought regime dropped and returned to a stable strategy with the return of those variability conditions. So that's a really big lesson for us. And I kind of summarize those points here in this last slide. And I think that's where I'll end. All right. Now there's a story to be had here about, what goes on with society. And again, you have to kind of just imagine if you have a relatively egalitarian hunting and gathering society that finds itself in a situation where they're living in a more settled communal environment, forming early villages. And now there's a series of problems that have to be solved about who gets what land to garden, what do you do with the surplus crops, how do you redistribute that, how do you solve disputes in your community, and more importantly, how do you solve disputes between communities? Because inevitably there's inequality that emerges amongst these communities, and that leads to conflict. All right. And I would say this is really the important thing that the Fremont archaeological record has to contribute to what we know about one of the most important events in human history, which is the transition to agriculture, that we can understand, in a very, very great level of detail, chronologically and environmentally, what those conditions looked like that these early societies formed. So, okay, I did pretty good in staying on my mark. I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions, but with that, just like to thank my research team, Eric Robinson, who is at just starting a tenure track position in the Department of Anthropology at Boise State. So hopefully you guys will hear from him in the near future. Great experience working in archaeological contexts all over the world. So I really do hope you guys hear from him. Justin DeRose is the dendrochronologist we work with. Eric and Justin and I were just awarded a National Science Foundation research grant to continue this work throughout parts of Utah. So hopefully I haven't bogged you guys down too much in the science, but this has been recognized as, I think, hopefully contributing something new to how we understand culture and climate in this context of an agricultural transition. Andrew McAllister, a close friend and photographer who's done all of my photography, and then folks, of course, at the at Dinosaur National Monument have been exceptionally supportive. So with that, I'll end.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I really liked how you touched not only on the culture, but you also hit the climate aspect too, because I definitely think that plays a key role, like you said. And then our first question is, was there any involvement either by Native American individuals or tribes in your research so far? And have they been able to, kind of add, their historic story or something into that?
So a couple of my students who were one who is a Northwestern Band Shoshone and another who is was Navajo have been part of my field crews. We haven't had a lot of collaboration with the Ute community. So I've had some conversations with Betsy Chabous, who's the tribal liaison, but we just haven't reached that stage where we're doing direct collaboration with the tribes yet. But hopefully that's gonna come as part of this National Science Foundation Award.
Awesome. And then obviously each culture is unique and their experiences are all different. But is the story of the Fremont people in terms of that, very narrow window of village settlements, is that similar to other um, tribes or cultures in the area?
Um, it's interesting. There's not one of the real serious challenges for the Fremont archaeological record, and I'm going to speak a little bit as a Fremont outsider right now, right? Is that the whole kind of narrative of the Shoshone has been, and that includes the Ute, has been that they arrived relatively recently into these areas that would be, southern Idaho, so the northern Shoshone and the eastern Shoshone and western Wyoming, and the Utes in northeastern Utah. And that again, and this is kind of this is the common wisdom, right? That those Ute people replaced the Shoshone and Ute people replaced the Fremont. And that's not something that my research in Western Wyoming in particular supports. And it's kind of one of the things that I'm hoping to build up to. And it really just requires a lot of kind of putting things into place, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the real challenge is that there's not a really strong oral tradition amongst the Shoshone people of an agricultural past, and certainly not of a village past, of living in a village like this, right? And so we're kind of operating out of that window of the oral histories. There's some suggestion that that there were Hopi people, and so ancestral Hopi and ancestral Kiowa people living in this area, and I think very likely mixing with what would have been ancestral Ute populations living in this area. But again, that's still kind of there's a lot of work to be done to kind of be able to suss that out. But I think the short answer is that this kind of story doesn't really exist in the oral traditions that I know.
Awesome. And then how did the Fremont people influence the land? Because we talked a lot about how the land kind of
Yeah,
directed how they would live. So besides dam made out of the land, and then also the rock paintings, was there any other evidence of how
sure.
they modified the land to suit them?
That's an awesome question. All right. And um, one of the things that we discovered, so, you know, again, my training is in geology, and so I'm constantly thinking about geological problems. And one of the things that you see in Cub Creek when you go in there is there's really big, deep arroyos, right? These deep, steep-sided drainages that are typical of a lot of desert environments. And there's a lot of questions about the environmental conditions under which arroyos form and how people influence the formation of arroyos, and likewise how they affect people, right? And because if you're a floodplain agriculturalist and the floodplain cuts it down and entrenches, then you're in trouble. You can't get water onto your crops anymore. So we've started to explore that because there's some pretty real expectations of these environmental conditions, um, particularly the shift in precipitation variability should trigger under the right geomorphic conditions a downcutting of the stream. And so we've been looking to demonstrate that. And I started that work in October. What we started to realize pretty quickly is that these geological environments have a lot of evidence of fire. And so we looked at another site this summer, and we're just right on the edge of the data right now. But and we're talking about massive amounts of sedimentation. I found some Fremont materials that are almost 4.5 meters below the surface, and they're about 1,000 years old. So that's a lot of sediment deposition in that amount of time. But what we see is a lot of stratified evidence of burning of the landscape. And so what you have to think about from an agricultural perspective, and this is very anthropological and people do this all over the world, is that they use fire to modify the landscape. And they have been doing this for time immemorial. But as an agriculturalist, you burn off an area and burn off all of the vegetation, and then you turn in that charcoal and ash, and that will serve as a kind of a fertilizer. It will enrich the soil, and then you grow your crops until the yields start to decline, and then you move on to a different area, let the vegetation grow back, and repeat this cycle. And so that's kind of what we refer to as, it's kind of classic slash and burn horticulture. And so that's something that we're really starting to see now, and it's not something we've thought a lot about, but it's certainly something we're going to be looking at more closely, because again, people were they knew how to manage these landscapes. These were very, very carefully managed landscapes for fire and water.
No, that's awesome that you're able to take, that stratification and really, come up with these stories of how these people lived, how they
Yeah,
were able to, adapt to that landscape.
yeah,
Because to me, if just looking at that landscape, I would not think, a whole civilization and culture would be able to thrive in that environment. Just a quick glance, because to me, it looks very arid.
it looks very like it's very hard to make a living there, but
Hmm.
it's a really, really great place for farming. And so one of the things that's been really fun is to take the you know the National Park Service division chiefs out and show them some of the things that we've been seeing. And if you drive into Cub Creek today, and in a lot of these places, you can't hardly walk around in the floodplains because they're so overgrown. And then you show them, a 4.5 meter sequence, about 15 feet of fire history that spans the
Hmm.
last 2,000 years, and say this place needs to burn. You need to light this place on fire.
Yeah.
Start
And you
over.
tell anyone that, and it's probably not going to be an easy conversation to have.
They're embracing it, and again, I mean, we're seeing now, and have been seeing, this is not news to anybody, right? We're
Hmm.
seeing the consequences of the combination of over a century of removing fire from the landscape coupled with climate change, and what you get
Hmm.
is really, really massive fires. So instead of fires that are adapted to frequent, or landscapes that are adapted to frequent fires.
Awesome. Well, thank you
So that's
again
definitely
for,
a lesson of the archaeological record. So
yeah, no, and I think it's really interesting, seeing that slow shift back into, that more cyclical approach, and kind of embracing how fire can actually be good in terms of a
yeah,
landscape.
yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of decisions we make moving into the future. And archaeology oftentimes is regarded as a novelty in
Hmm.
that we find cool things, right? And so, like for example, Cooper's Ferry archaeological site up there on the Salmon River is one of the oldest dated archaeological sites in North America now, right? That's super, super cool. That gets a lot of attention, right? Yes, we learn that people were here a long time ago, but we don't learn a lot about how archaeology can inform our landscape, cultural, and natural resource management policies today. And I hope that this kind of work is really a kind of guide for that.
Well, hopefully it will be. And unfortunately, we are out of time today. So I just wanted to say thank you again for
Yeah.
all the information and the wonderful presentation. Thank you
Thank
to
you guys.
everyone that attended.
I hope that I didn't go too far over your heads with multi-plots and wavelet analyses, but this is how we learn about climate in the past, and I think it's important to try to get that information out there. So thank you guys all. Again, I have no idea who you are. I would like to see your faces, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good one.
You too.